Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And we're on a book club episode today, brought to us by Baker Academic, the publishers of the new book we're going to be talking about today, the Augustine Way: Retrieving a Vision for the Church's Apologetic Witness. And we have both authors on today, Joshua Chatraw and Mark Allen. And we're going to be jumping into this episode here in a moment. And if you guys know, this 4th and 5th century early church father, he has a couple pronunciations and titles that you guys have maybe heard of before. Saint Augustine. He's also been pronounced Augustine or Augustine or Augustine of Hippo. So if you guys, there's going to be some information in our show notes about him and this book. And of course, there's going to be two major works of St. Augustine, Confessions and City of God, that we're going to cite a few times in this episode as well. So there's also some information in our show notes about Baker Academic and also our bridge builders, especially Logos Bible Software, and then how to find a church to call home. If you're not already at a church as a member, you can click that local church finder and find a Reformed or confessional church near your area. So I'll let Peter further introduce our co-authors today, Joshua Chatraw and Mark Allen.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having Dr. Joshua Chatraw. And if you guys see his name, he was kind enough to tell us how it was actually pronounced. It looks like Chatraw, but it's Chatraw. He's the Billy Graham Chair of Evangelism, I think newly minted, in cultural engagement at Beeson Divinity School. He lives with his wife and 2 children in Birmingham, Alabama. And Dr. Mark D. Allen, professor of biblical and theological studies at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. He served as pastor and church planter for over 20 years. It's a pleasure having you both on the show, Dr. Chatraw and Allen.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Of course, yeah. So my cold open kind of fun question. It's not necessarily about you two. Usually it's about the authors, editors of the book, but this is about Augustine. This is the age-old debate. So I want to figure this out right now, and maybe you guys know what I'm about to ask. How do you pronounce it? Is it Augustine? Is it Augustine? Is it like kind of adiaphora? Doesn't really matter. What's your personal take on the matter?
It's Augustine. All the cool people say Augustine. But I think actually it can go either way.
Okay.
I think it can go either way. But the professors I've studied under have pronounced it Augustine.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Chatraw, what about you? What's your say on the matter?
I think that's right. I don't make a big deal out of this. So I don't. I'm just happy for reading Augustine. So,
There's those who've been saying Augustine this whole time. Is like, how dare you pronounce his name wrong?
Well, I think we have bigger things to worry about. But yeah, we go with Augustine. So that's what we'll stick with in this interview.
Cool.
That's right.
Sounds good. So my first real actual question after kind of the easier question, the controversial, if you want to say. So Dr. Chatraw, we'll start with you, and Dr. Allen after. Let our listeners know a little about yourself, your background, and what you do. Because I know it was something, and like you've added something, or it's kind of switched. So maybe let them know who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So the last 5 years, I've been a resident theologian at Holy Trinity Anglican Church and the director for the Center for Public Christianity in Raleigh, North Carolina. And in the next few months, I will be moving to Birmingham, and I will be joining the faculty at Beeson Divinity School, which is on the campus of Samford University. And I'll be teaching
Samford, not Stanford, correct?
Yes, Samford in Birmingham. And I'll be teaching courses on apologetics, evangelism, probably sneak some Augustine in there as well.
I was about to say something kind of down your alley. Those two topics. Cool. Awesome. What about you, Dr. Allen?
I came to Liberty about 10 years ago to be the chair of the Biblical and Theological Studies Department. did that for a while. And then Josh came to Liberty and started the Center for Apologetics and Cultural Engagement. And when he transitioned down to Raleigh, then I became the director of the Center for Apologetics and Cultural Engagement here at Liberty University. And then now I'm transitioning out of that and doing more PhD and grad teaching in the area of apologetics. And I'm moving into public theology. My PhD is actually in Hebrew Bible.
Interesting.
So
Nice.
it's kind of been a journey. And I planted a church in Richmond, Virginia, and then pastored another church in Indiana. So that's what I've been doing. I've been married for 40 years to Karen.
Nice. You've been married as long as Nick has been alive.
I know. It's what that's crazy. It's hard for me to believe. 5 grandkids, 3 kids. So
yeah, and if I can piggyback off that, because I think one of the unique things about this project is me and Mark's friendship, in that we met at Liberty really 10 years ago. And I was trained under a biblical scholar, trained to do biblical theology for my PhD. And but I was pastoring at the time. And when you're getting a PhD and you're pastoring in a rural area, folks don't say, hey, well, you're doing your PhD in biblical theology, so I'll stick to questions in your area. They have this kind of idea that, as pastors, you should be able to help them with any kind of spiritual problem, which I think is quite right.
Yep.
But sometimes in the academy, we get in our kind of area and we get kind of narrowed in on that.
100%.
And we think, well, we can't speak to anything else. And that's probably something going on with kind of modern academic life. It was very foreign, for instance, to Augustine's kind of view of pastoral ministry and himself as a theologian. But so all of a sudden I'm pastoring and I'm getting all of these apologetic type questions. And that, while I was doing my PhD, really opened up this kind of world of, hey, I just need to help people. I've got to think through that. And pretty quickly that opened up some methodological questions, that opened up questions about, okay, how is this being done, and what's working and what doesn't work. And so by the time I got to Liberty for my first academic post, I meet Mark there, and we're kind of wrestling with some of these kind of big methodological questions together as I'm teaching apologetic courses, having kind of tried to work through this in a pastoral context for 5 years. And Mark's bringing almost 20 years of pastoral experience.
Yeah.
So we're both kind of coming at this, both as pastors and as generalists with academic training, and asking very on the ground kind of questions.
Yeah.
And that, what came through that is a textbook we wrote together, Apologetics at the Cross.
Yeah.
And
I've
when
heard
we
about
got to kind of the end of that, we had this intuition that Augustine might help us.
Yeah. I wonder why you thought Augustine might help you. It's not as if he's really good at this or anything.
Well, and this might, I'm jumping ahead probably to where we want to go in the interview here, but so we of course had read Augustine by this time in our theological training, but never so much as an apologist, not even so much as a pastor. We had read him as a theologian. We had read him maybe as a philosopher.
Which I think how most people read him first is about those two things, not about the other things.
Yeah.
So that kind of so we wrote that book together, and then of course we've done some other things since then, but we came back to Augustine and said, let's do this second book together as we kind of work through how Augustine might help us. And so I want to say it, common interest, some common background, and also a deep friendship that grew as we wrote Apologetics at the Cross and generated certain questions. And in a way that I think Augustine would appreciate, we're working this out as friends, and it's really important to Augustine as well.
Yeah. So let's for those who are listening are like, okay, great, they're talking about Augustine, but who on earth is this Augustine guy? This Saint Augustine of Hippo. So maybe provide a brief bio of Augustine, who he is, what he did, and some major works, because you interact with some of these things towards the beginning of your book too.
Augustine lived from 354 to about 430, and he lived mostly in North Africa, and that's where he did ministry. That was his context, but his influence, as you know, has gone way beyond in that space, that time. It has had a shaping effect on Roman Catholic theology. It's had a shaping effect on Reformed theology, Reformation theology. We have 5 million words that Saint Augustine wrote, and many different genres. He had discourses against the Donatists and the Manichees, and went head to head with Pelagius. He also wrote, though, all these sermons. We have letters, correspondence as he did ministry, as he reached out administratively, actually outside the church into the community. Probably his most popular books are obviously Confessions, City of God, on the Trinity, on Christian doctrine. And I think the point that we've made, and that is very important to our book and our apologetic, is he was primarily a pastor, doing pastoral ministry on the ground in his location, defending his faith. And I think it's also important to know that as a young man, he walked away from the faith. I mean, if we were talking about him
from his mother's faith, essentially.
What's that?
From his mother's faith, essentially.
Essentially, yes. Her Catholic Christian faith. He walks away from it, and for quite a while, and doesn't come back to the faith until he's an older adult. And I think it's important to know as well that he lived in a highly pluralistic society. Obviously, prior to Augustine, Christianity had impacted the empire. We know that, but especially with the City of God and the fall of Rome, the paganism was sort of being reimagined and coming back. So he was dealing with sort of a, tongue-in-cheek, sort of a post-Christian time.
Are you talking about 2023? Or are you talking about 430? This sounds
right.
Very similar.
That's right. It has many touch points, not exactly the same, but many touch points.
Awesome. Yeah. What about Dr. Chatraw? Anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just to maybe just one small thing, pick up on the thing Mark just said, was that he's unique in that where he's ministering is a kind of like, it's right before Christendom. So it's at this time where, yes, there's all of a sudden Christianity has just received this kind of stamp of approval. And yet it still wasn't so dominant that it was just, to use a Charles Taylor, the philosopher's expression, it wasn't just the automatic social imaginary of everyone. There was this resurgent paganism, and at this point, Augustine had to deal with the claim that Christianity was the big civic problem by the pagans. So it wasn't just that Christianity is not true. The pagans were saying, actually, Christianity is not good for society. And you don't get that kind of objection in the same way once you jump into Christendom, because it's right before, but it was big enough to be kind of the a scapegoat in a way that it wasn't so in the first couple hundred years because it was so small, and in a way that it wouldn't be in just a few years later once Christendom fully arrives on the scene and completely dominates. And so that's one of the reasons why we find Augustine's time period so interesting, because he's really having to deal with some of the things that we can kind of map on our contemporary context. Again, as Mark alluded to, some real differences. Anytime you do the work of history, we need to note the real differences, but we're also trying to map on some things that we can learn by analogy.
Yeah, totally.
I think another touch point that we've already alluded to is it was an epochal change. There was a destabilizing time that he was living in where there was a great change. And I think we can look at similarities that were here between Christendom, post-Christendom. This sort of modernity, post-modernity, late modernity. So it's a time of sort of destabilizing, confusing time for many people.
Totally. Yep.
Yeah, and to reflect on that, I found that really personally interesting as well. Augustine living in the pre-Christendom time period, and time period called late antiquity, and then Christendom happened, and then now we're right now in post-Christendom.
Yeah.
So like you guys were saying,
Yeah, we kind of bookend.
There
in a
is,
sense.
we can pull back on Augustine actually now with more relevance than maybe even a century or two ago.
I don't know that we can't even read him better, maybe today, given the touch points that we have with him.
Exactly.
That maybe we won't bring some of the Enlightenment or modernistic baggage into our reading, and perhaps we can hear him a little bit better and hear his voice clearer today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I really resonate and relate to the prodigal son stories. So when I first got into I always knew of Augustine, but I actually starting to read him, which is different and good, because living in the 5th century with him, reading his works, I just got done with City of God and Confessions, and really understanding his prodigal son story resonated with me as probably a lot of Christians. The same way, like someone like C.S. Lewis, it's very him going back into a beautiful way of explaining Christianity, and so we can talk more about that in this episode, and also talking about where he was living. Found it really fascinating too. We're talking about Roman Northern Africa, where his father was a Roman and his mother was a native African. I think a lot of people need to realize that, Christianity had a lot of origins and beginnings in the early church in Africa.
Yeah.
And so that's helpful for a context as well. So my first question kind of going into this is, at the foundation of this work, the two books penned by Augustine, which I just mentioned, Confessions and City of God, with everything that Augustine wrote, why focus on these two books in particular?
Yeah, because there was 5 million words. So
there's so much that
that's
you
a
could focus on,
pragmatic answer. No, we have better answers than that. But I'll let Mark give hopefully some more of the details. Let me maybe tell a little story that gets at this through the back door. I mentioned earlier we had this intuition that, hang on, Augustine might help us here as we finished our textbook years ago, and so I began to read some on Augustine as apologist. And by the way, there's not a lot done in that area. But I was reading this article on that, and I realized that the author, although I think it was in many ways a helpful article, but the author hadn't said much about Confessions in the City of God. Now he mentions them, and to his credit, he says, yeah, I think that both of them are in some sense apologetic works, but he spends most of his time on other books by Augustine, and he seemed to be wanting to pull out what we might describe as something akin to later scholastic or analytical arguments from some things Augustine would say here or there, or some of his other works. But I couldn't escape the fact that Augustine says that City of God is his major apologetic work. I mean, so here we are kind of picking and choosing. The author himself
gave you the answer.
Yeah.
We're picking and choosing to fit our own preconceived notion about what apologetics is, rather than coming to Augustine and saying, okay, what is he actually doing in its entirety in the city of God. Because I think a lot of times you take city of God and it's such a massive work, and we just get lost in the details. And so then, well, what is there to retrieve? What is there to learn? This is not exactly our context. But when I came to it and took a step back, I began to see what he was doing at a macro level. And I saw at a macro level, he was doing things that we could appropriate and that we even should appropriate for a context today. And then I saw in Confessions that he is seeking to persuade people to love God. And he was seeking to persuade people that God is good and beautiful. And in those two significant ways, if we could model and map out what Augustine's doing and learn from him, that would be doing a great service for the church today. And so I think that's where we said, hang on, let's take macro. What is he doing in his two most influential works? And maybe because we have read them, looking at them solely as maybe a political work or a theological work or a devotional work, what if we read them with an understanding of his context, understanding that there's this kind of pluralism going on, and he's writing to people who are wrestling and feeling fragilized by their faith, even if they are Christians. He recognized that Christians were doubting because of these new pressures, and he recognized that the pagans were very resistant of Christianity. And so he's writing both books, I think, with that in mind. And that's why what Mark mentioned earlier, perhaps now in our context today, we can go back and actually see Augustine with fresh eyes, given his context, and see that, yes, he is writing, in some sense, devotional material. He is writing, he's doing the work of pedagogy for the church. But for Augustine, soul care and apologetics are really attached and connected in a deep way that I think we often don't see in our modern context as much.
I would think it's that thematic connection between the two. I think once you read The City of God, and then you reflect on Confessions, you see the reason he could do such societal and cultural critique and speak to the culture is because he himself went through it. It was his journey. And so you can imagine someone in his congregation who the pressures of paganism, Greco-Roman culture on their faith. And here's Augustine saying, look, I left the faith and I tried Manichaeism, and it's Manichaeism is kind of like, think Star Wars, think transcultural religion, that kind of eclectic mix of religions. That's the hip, it's for the hipsters. And he said, I tried that, and I tried philosophy, I tried the academics, I denied everything that we could know anything. He tried that. He says, basically, I was on the fast track to success. And, he made it all the way to the center of the Roman Empire. He was sort of the press secretary for the emperor. I tried all this. And I came back to the Christian faith. So you can see where that is an apologetic. I mean, that is very persuasive for his, in his personal walk. And, Henry Nouwen says that which is most personal is most universal. And so he's given his personal, as a pastor, a journey through all of these different ways of being in that culture. And he's saying it didn't work out. And so it is an apologetic Confessions. And that's easier to recognize once you see, what's going on in the City of God. So,
before next question, it didn't strike me until about a minute ago, but it just sounds a little like Solomon's Ecclesiastes, a little bit. We're like, hey, I was at the top of my game, had all the wealth in the world, all the women you could have wanted. I've done it, I've tried it, but man, it's just not there. I got to go back to Yahweh.
And he starts Confessions. Our hearts are restless till they find rest in you. He had this restless heart. That he was looking, he was searching success, religion, education, and the right circle of friends. All these things. He tried them, and he was left with his heart just shattered and broken.
Yeah.
And anyway, we see so many connection points there with the world we're living in today.
Totally.
And then more biblically speaking, it makes sense that he echoes and leans on the Apostle Paul so much. I mean, with his beautiful apologetics and going back to the gospel, I mean, Romans and all of other Paul's epistles and work, New Testament writings, and then Psalms too. Augustine really leans on. And then also just with Augustine's his framework of his high view of God, his ontology that he explains both theologically and philosophy, and explanation. If you guys read Confessions and City of God, there's a lot of explanations of our soul, and the hope in the gospel. So also to the magnum opus, his City of God, he finished just a few years before he passed away in 430. I think he finished in 426, if I'm not mistaken. And then I don't know if this piece of information is correct. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but Confessions is the most widely read work after the New Testament. Have you heard that before?
I'm not sure about that, but I know Pascal at the end of his life gave away his library, but he kept two books, the Bible and Confessions.
There we go.
And so, that would seem right to me, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Throughout this book that you guys wrote, you make some comparisons between the time Augustine lived in our own, and we've talked about that with the pre-Christendom and post-Christendom times. Though there are certainly dissimilarities between our context and his, how might we take some cues from Augustine's engagement with his culture and apply them to our own, especially in Western America?
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe I can jump in here and start this. I think I would want to back up and I think in this conversation, we've assumed something that is not always assumed when we start talking about apologetics, which is that context is really important.
Mm-hmm.
There is no, what we would argue, there's no context-free apologetic.
No.
And with that, there's a connection with this. This is not what we would call a repristination project. This isn't what exactly did Augustine do, and then let's just map exactly what he did to today, because we recognize there's both continuities and discontinuities.
Yeah, not like 10 ways Augustine did apologetics. Now you do the same 10 things, and you'll get exactly the same results.
Or here's exactly how Augustine made this universal argument against the pagans, and now let's imagine that our pagans are just like his pagans, and then we can plug and play it. Instead, what we're doing is retrieving. And so our questions are, how do we take the resources and the patterns and the theology and the moral psychology of Augustine, his analysis of human nature, how do we take that, and then how do we actually lean into what we would call like our modern kind of pagan context today, and so, or our modern cultural context. And so, for instance, one of our arguments, kind of that we at least make in passing in the book, is, there's different people you could retrieve, and I think that's right. It's not just like we just need Augustine. We're only doing one attempt, and you can retrieve from different times, but I think there is something particular about Augustine's context, in a way that if we retrieve, say, a medieval theologian who's operating within Christendom, where the social imaginary basically assumes Christianity, I think that's going to impact, and I do believe that it's going to impact the way they make their arguments. And so we still can retrieve those thinkers for apologetics, but there might be less direct connections to context because they're operating within Christendom. And so we're not saying that the developments that have happened during that time period, like those, Like, let's look all 2,000 years and what's helpful, what's important here that we can learn from what they were doing. But Augustine in particular, because of what we noted before, he's operating in this, this kind of on the edges of Christendom, before Christendom, I think, and in this pluralistic context, that really can help us in some unique ways. This could be even more relevant than maybe some other figures. And we mentioned this in the book, Pascal picks up on this. And so as
I just finished his Pensées, and it's like they're incredibly similar. Yeah.
So when he gets on Pascal's looking at kind of the beginning of, the end of Christendom, and he's trying to figure out kind of how to navigate. And where does he pick up? He picks up Augustine. He seems to imbibe kind of Augustine's patterns and some of his theology of a way to try to persuade. So again, I think Pascal's doing his own type of retrieval in his particular context of Augustine. So we've already mentioned the pluralism. Let me give you two more reasons why I think Augustine's context is particularly helpful. One is Augustine is operating within a space where philosophers are arguing about what is the happy life, what is the good life. And in the midst of our context in the West, a time of fragmentation, a time of confusion, which is characterized by an ongoing mental health crisis, a loneliness epidemic. We're experiencing widespread angst and anxiety. The last 5 years, I've been leading a fellows program for the Center for Public Christianity, where we spend 9 months with a group of leaders in the age range of 25 to 45, and sharing life and sharing struggles with each other. And I mean, one of the things that come up over and over is just the deep experience of loneliness, of anxiety, of despair even. And people are asking the question, where do we find the good life, with an increasing urgency?
Yeah.
And so this is a question that for Augustine isn't some kind of separate thing you do in soul care. But for Augustine, this is an apologetic question. So when he, as Mark's already said, when he starts his kind of his story-shaped prayer, which is Confessions, which is also his intellectual journey to Christianity, he actually combines those things. But he starts with, my heart was restless. And it's this deep desire to find rest and peace. And he sees that as connected with this intellectual journey he's on. And then, of course, in City of God, the whole book is mapped up around ultimately two cities that are defined by their two loves, love of self or love of God. And so this dense theological apologetic work is framed by two loves, two ultimate ends. And so for him, this question of the good life isn't something we sideline while we do our intellectual arguments, but because of his anthropology, because of his theology, he sees humans as both moral creatures and intellectual creatures, and we can't neatly separate those two. And so that is going to impact, and does impact, how he does apologetics in a way that I think has increasing relevance in our time of kind of in a therapeutic age, as Philip Reif describes that we're in today. The third thing, and I'll mention quickly because I've taken too long here, is that he's operating in a time where people are feeling the panic of what's next, the panic of the ground beneath us is coming undone because Rome has fallen. Where's the stability? And they're feeling fragilized in their faith if they're believers. And the skeptics have renewed vigor against Christianity because they're blaming Christianity. And Augustine says, let's pack it in. But he says, hey, let's actually make an argument. So what's interesting in all of this, all the arguments about desire and belief, which are central to him, that we're doxological creatures, he still goes and pens, a 22-book work, a huge volume. So he is not anti-intellectual by any means.
No.
But he's saying, but he has this fuller, more robust anthropology as he's making his arguments, as he's appealing to them than we often do today.
Yeah, Dr. Allen, I want to hear from you. I want to add something though to what Dr. Chatraw was saying. There's two podcasts that I've been following, actually since reading more Augustine lately, and since actually reading Dr. Watkin, his biblical critical theory. But it was 10% Happier from Dan Harris, and then The Happiness Project from Gretchen Rubin, who deal with exactly these things, and they think of the same way. And so when I'm listening to them, and I'm reading Augustine, I'm reading your book, I'm like, they're wondering about the same things that Augustine's wondering about 1600, 1700 years ago. But because, like you said, there's this epidemic of loneliness and depression, and there's different resources as well for those too. But it is a deeply human problem, and they're like, I think the top 10 podcasts in the world right now because people are wondering about this stuff, and we think it's purely an intellectual question. We have to get like kind of intellectual things done. We do, but we're forgetting, like Augustine said, that people's loves are mixed, and loves are disordered, and so they're looking for things in the wrong places. So Dr. Allen, if you want to add to what Chatraw had just said.
I don't have a lot to add. I think one of the things that Josh mentioned and is the importance of social imaginaries. And
I have that book 5 feet in front of me right now.
Okay. Yeah, and it has been very, very, very helpful for us. In fact, I've taught a PhD course where I required Charles Taylor and City of God and Confessions to read, and then to dialogue between the two. But I think it's very important to be aware of these social imaginaries and help students. When I teach apologetics and cultural engagement to freshmen and sophomore students here at Liberty University, I tell them that this is a great opportunity for you here at college. Okay, you're leaving home. Maybe you've been homeschooled. Maybe you've grown up in the same place. Maybe you've thought within sort of your Christian or your framework, and this is a great place for you to sort of unscrew your top of your head and look at your brain, and not just think, don't just think, but think about how you think and how have you been formed. What's the social imaginary? How are you conceiving the world? And so, I tell a story about a short one about two young fish are swimming along, and then an older fish comes by, and the older fish says, "Hey, how's the water today?" And then the old fish kind of swims on, and the two younger fish look at each other and say, "What the heck is water?" And because they're swimming in it, they're living in it. They're not. And so I think part of apologetics and part of what Augustine did in the first part of the City of God is he helped his society, his culture, to become aware of their social imaginary and aware of the categories that they were thinking in, and to help them to understand the well duh statements need to be challenged, things that they take for granted and assume. So anyway, I think that's when it comes to context in doing apologetics, we need to understand our how we've been affected by the social imaginary and how those we're sharing Christ with see the world. And Stephen Covey said once, you look inside your own head and think you've seen the world. And I think, we have to, it helps to understand these social imaginaries and these, well done statements.
And I just to add to that real quick, because Mark just gave a lot of really good examples and illustrations. If the way Taylor kind of puts it directly is it's the way we almost precognitively inhabit and through patterns or symbols and stories and kind of our cultural inheritance. Therefore, it's just as Mark was saying, almost this is just common sense. It's how you just see the world. You can't imagine it otherwise. And so oftentimes it's those assumptions that people make by which that kind of their reasoning is operating with. And you see this, and just to bring it back to Augustine, you see it in Augustine early on when I teach confessions. In the early chapters of Confessions, people are like, what's he going on? What's going on? He's talking about his childhood and pardon me, his education and what, but it seems to be he's kind of saying, I kind of inhabited this world where my teachers were teaching me the story of Roman glory.
Mhm.
And it just became kind of absorbed in him through his education, through his parents' ambition. And so he seems to kind of be recognizing how of course, this is Taylor's terminology, but we're anachronistically putting on to Augustine, but he seems to recognize something like the social imaginaries at work in his own life. And so then when he goes to City of God and he wants to make these arguments in the first 10 books, he actually kind of enters not only the great books of the pagans and the philosophers, but he enters their social imaginary. He understands their poets, he understands their great stories, and he enters into those in order to ultimately offer what philosophers call an immanent critique of those, critiquing them on their own terms. But he's very aware of this kind of the way people kind of imagine the world based on the stories they're told, the symbols that they've adopted, the symbols through its society, and that maps on pretty well, I think, with what Marcus is describing through Charles Taylor.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's a great transition into my next question, and to kind of to summarize it. And I'm sure you're aware of it, and our listeners are somewhat aware of it, but there tends to be debate in apologetic circles, like what's the best way to debate, what's the best apologetic method, and it tends to be, again, kind of generalizing between classical apologetics and between presuppositional apologetics. And you guys specifically call out these two, and I'm sure there's more, but these are kind of the two dominating ones on like how to do apologetics versus what you're saying, kind of contextual apologetics. And they both treat, and I like how you guys put it, although they think each one of them is like starkly different than the other, they both treat humans, relatively speaking, and generalizing, as thinking things on sticks, as brains on sticks, just kind of walking around contextless. So, and they don't neglect some things, and so with Augustine, though, and like you guys are saying, he's talking about desires, he's talking about loves, he's talking about longing. He's not distancing intellectual arguments. But how might some of these ways that like we think apologetics should be done, how might this be, thinking of Augustine, how might that help correct, you can call it the two camps or whatever it is, and how we approach these conversations?
Yeah. And this is where, for people who are initiated into this world of apologetics, can know things can get really dicey really quick.
Yeah. There's one way to do it, and then if you do it the wrong way, then you are not reformed, or you're not apologetic, or whatever it is.
Yeah, things can get dicey and things can get a little tribal, and we want to try to avoid the tribalism as much as we can, and we want to start off by saying that Mark and I both learned a ton from people in both camps, and we want to say that there are tendencies within the camps that we see that we're calling out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who would say that they're presuppositionalist or they're classical apologist or evidential, and we're just kind of put classical and evidential together there. Just for our purposes right now, we're saying that there's tendencies, but we also recognize that even within those camps there's a spectrum, and within those camps there's kind of reform movements that we see going on, and we acknowledge that in the book and in the footnotes as well. So just want to add some kind of things, just because this gets pretty quick. And what we want to say, if I can kind of reframe this a little, well, and then one more thing I need to say, this is what academics do. I need to tip our hat to our friend Jamie Smith. And if people are familiar with Jamie's work, we'll hear some of the language you were using there.
Cultural liturgy stuff, all that.
Yeah, and Jamie's a friend, and has been. I don't think we're necessarily tracking on everything, but he has been so formative, I think, in some of the ways, and driving us back to Augustine. Look at him again, and so we take his taxonomy here that he gives in his book, Desiring the Kingdom, and we say that it's often tends to be the case that evidentialists, at least functionally, treat people primarily as thinking beings. Okay, here's the evidence. And so it's just, there it is. Deal with the evidence, deal with the facts. There it is. Presuppositionalists, and this is how I might reframe it just a little bit from what you said, tend to emphasize that we must first believe in order to understand. You must believe a whole constellation of things about about God and who he is to really ground your rational thinking. Again, to your point, you're still trying to oftentimes what can ground rational predication, and they're saying, you know, only Christianity can do that. And so, but they're still affirming this kind of, you must believe in order to understand, which is Augustinian.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to say that in some sense, the evidentialists who are emphasizing that we are rational beings are Augustinian. Because Augustine, if you read the works, he wants to emphasize that too. But Augustine also recognizes that we are moved by our loves, that we are at the core doxological beings. The question for Augustine is not will we worship, but the question is who or what we will worship.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're arguing is that we need a more holistic approach, which doesn't say we're not rational beings, or that doesn't in any way say, you know, deny which the idea that you have to believe to understand. We all have faith on things. We all have to believe things that we can't ultimately prove in order to live. And so we're all in some sense believing to understand. But as I've mentioned before, when Augustine sets out to write Confessions, he starts with his intellectual quest with this question of where he can find rest. And then City of God, he's saying, hey, we have this longing for happiness. We have this longing for true joy. We have this longing for peace and justice. Now, where can we go to actually find that? And so he sees these kind of intellectual pursuits as really a pursuit to find God. But the problem is, in our sinful nature, we both want God and we don't want God. And that's the paradox. We're both running to him and running away from him. We're both running to find happiness as the prodigal son was, but we're looking for this happiness in all the wrong places. And so the intellectual questions can't be kind of in a simplistic way shut off from that. And so the way this translates, now that might seem, okay, but how does this actually work? Well, what this gives us is it gives us a way to do diagnostic work as we're engaging other people. So rather than simply, you know, here are the 5 ways, take it or leave it. Either you're smart enough to get it or you're not. Instead, what we're doing as we're talking to people is we're fundamentally asking in lots of different ways, this little expression that we pick up from Sarah Coakley, which is, what do you seek? What are you seeking? Where are true joys to be found? What are you longing for? And to actually see those questions of the heart tied to the intellect, tied to what we believe. And then that gives us a whole range, and as we develop this in the book, a whole range of kind of tools to kind of actually do diagnostic work, ask better questions, engage in what we think are more humane ways, because it sees people more holistically. And it comes alongside them. And because oftentimes they're working not with worldviews in a technical sense, like, you know, everyone has a worldview. Well, yes and no. They're more living out a kind of social imaginary, and they haven't often thought through this. But they're living for certain things and for certain ends because they view those things as the good life. And so we're trying to dig deeper underneath and use the patterns and skills that Augustine gives us and teach other people to do the same, so that we can have conversations that try to get to the heart and try to get to the deeper issues of the gut. That's often the things that are driving us intellectually.
Yeah,
That's good.
Yeah, Dr. Allen, what do you have to add to that?
well, I think it's, to me, I don't want to paint this as all, you know, just perfect and good and easy, but I feel that because what we learn to do in this methodology is ask better questions. Ask people better questions about their heart. You know, what are they seeking? What are their loves? if they are engaged in some kind of spiritual remix, and well, how is that helping you live, and how is it helping you die? Ask these questions. And I've seen two different situations where one was a Christian and one was certainly not a Christian, and they got really mad at me. I mean, they were hot. And just instead of reacting with arguments and intellectual, kind of back and forth, asking honest questions about, now, is this what you're trying to say? Or is this your perspective? And when you're, I can tell you this, one of the ones that I was in a conversation with on an airplane, which I'm not usually that person, but on an airplane, who was found out, that I was a Christian, and she knew my location was Liberty University. And there was some real anger. I mean, sometimes she wouldn't talk, sometimes she would just be angry. And I just kept asking questions until the end. We had a very civil conversation. And I found out that she was brought up a Christian, but would be abused before the church service and then taken to church. And if I would have argued with her on an intellectual, exchange, now it does get intellectual. That is an important part of it. But we want to get to the place where the gospel and the healing of Jesus Christ can touch where the person is actually wounded and hurting. And so I think just asking good soul questions and being honestly interested. And I think there's a joy of connecting in that way with another person's humanity. Mm-hmm. As I said, it's not a cure-all. It doesn't mean every conversation is going to turn out, have a happy ending. But I have seen people open up.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean, and one of the things we show at the end of the book is some different examples, some different people we would say are doing this. And sometimes it's very confrontational. And so we're not trying to say that there's never a time for kind of blunt conversation. This isn't so much so part of what Augustine brings, although sometimes the tone he takes we wouldn't take, but what he's giving is a methodology, or what we describe as a way, which hangs on a kind of pastoral wisdom. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it's going to be very direct, but it's going to hang on kind of the virtue of the apologist. And that's why we spend a good bit of time talking about how is an apologist formed, and how to and we see resources in Augustine for how he sees actually the Christian teacher, the Christian apologist, actually formed within the life of the church. And this is something a lot of times it's not focused on, as if, well, apologetics is simply about arguments rather than the life of the apologist and the wisdom and the virtue and walking in step with the Spirit in conversation. So I don't want folks to hear that this is never confrontational, but what it does, and one of the big points in the book is that Augustine uses all of these, as Mark just was, medicinal language and metaphors. He loves that, right? And so he's talking about healing and how the gospel brings healing in God, and reordering loves brings healing. And but at times he has to take out a surgical equipment and do something that's going to be hurtful in a sense, or feel like painful to the person, because he's doing that work, but he's ultimately doing it for the aim so that he can apply the balm of Christ.
Yes.
And so it's not just a takedown, but it's an opening up of the wound so you can clean it out and put on the gospel. And if those cuts are made in a sloppy way, if those cuts are made in a way to cut down, or because of our libido dominandi, our desire to dominate or control, then you lose an Augustinian apologetic, and you lose the ability to point to Jesus as the great physician, which Augustine loved to do. And so this is a both a confrontation at times, and that needs to be handled pastorally and with wisdom, but it's going to be confrontation, and that's part of this, but it's ultimately with the aim of healing.
Love it.
Yeah, and reflecting on some things real quick before my question, just getting from you guys and recently being on a diet of Augustine, just knowing that Augustine is not one-dimensional. And what I mean by that is thinking about today, even we're speaking into a very paganistic society and culture, just like he was. And there was a lot of intellectual skeptics like are today, a lot of non-Christian philosophers in his day, a lot of, we can see that kind of relevance today as well. So there's so much confusion and fear, like you're saying, and he can answer to the most learned non-Christian people and keep up with them and actually answer to them with a very intellectual defense of God and Christianity, but also, to your guys' point, underlining that's not neglecting connecting to the heart. He's doing that really at the same time. He's answering in the most beautiful, profound ways, intellectual ways of the defense of God, philosophical, theological, everything, but it's also connecting to the heart. So he really does bridge that gap between the head and the heart. And he has just a huge skill on doing that. So I don't know if I said that correctly, if you guys agree with that before my actual question.
Yeah, and I would just say, if you look at some of the, I mean, he has such range, and I think this is why, we're coming back, and if you have a certain vision of what apologetics is, you're pulling out these, maybe trying to pull out certain nuggets. But if you actually see, at least in Confessions and City of God, they're both in some sense telling a story. They're both in some sense narrative. And then within that narrative, they have supporting arguments. They're using metaphor. They're appealing to people on different levels. And I think you really see, I think for our age, when people especially are picking up on this, the power of story and the power of narrative. Even if you'd say, well, I don't have a worldview, we're just consuming narrative through songs and Netflix and everything. It's like, no, we're still trafficking in narrative, and then it seems like there's something about human nature and narrative, and Augustine brings those two genres, not the only genres he has, but he certainly in Confessions and City of God seems to be utilizing that in a pretty powerful way.
Yeah, and in today's culture and society, people are admitting that they are worshiping something. I'm just generally speaking, and they are more than okay with worshiping something that is not the one true God. And so we're going back to Augustine saying, no, yes, we all worship something, but this is why we need to worship the one true God and not anything else.
Yeah, the gods are immanent. And so once you describe that, if you just go up to somebody and say, who's secular, and say, what are you worshiping? I think they might be like, no, I'm not worshiping. I don't believe in God. But if you start defining worship as, what's ultimate in your life, what's most important to you, and I think this is where we as we need to be nimble, right? I think we need to say, I wouldn't recommend coming up and saying to somebody, what are you worshiping? That I would just say, so what's meaningful in your life? Let's have a conversation about, where do you really go for hope? Where do you really go for where do you find value? What's meaningful in your life? And I think if you start talking to somebody on that level, very quickly, that you're getting at what they're worshiping. You're getting at what are the imminent gods of our age. And I think, and that's what I mean by a kind of modern paganism, but they're looking in those kind of imminent gods, the sex or their iPhone or technology or whatever it is, career, family. They're looking to kind of tap cosmic significance, and so being able to kind of say, no, actually, this is theology and theology, because you're worshiping and I'm worshiping. Now let's have that conversation about what's more rational.
Yeah.
And so so that's at least one way. There's different ways to get in these conversations. But if you just come in with exactly Augustine's language, or the language of worship, you kind of have to, they probably will be confused. You have to get there. So there is translation here as you talk to people.
Yeah. A point you make in the middle of the book is the unfortunate divorce of apologetics from the local church that we see. And we have apologetic ministries that are in no concrete way fueled or attached to the church in some ways. Why might this be a problem for the way apologetics are done and how the church engages with culture? Can Augustine's pastoral, philosophical, as a theologian and apologist model aid the church's divine mission?
Now, that's quite a big idea, but
Yeah.
you really can't divorce Augustine's apologetic from his experience on the ground as a bishop, a pastor in North Africa and Hippo, and that the people who were right in front of him, the culture and the goings on right where he was shepherding those people in a certain context. So if we think of the universal church, well, the local church is the universal church localized in a particular people in a particular location. And so when we're doing apologetics, it's not one size fits all. We have arguments for the faith. We have evidence for the faith, but those need to be contextualized to the people who are right in front of us. I mean, if you think of 1 Peter 3:15, when Paul was saying, be ready to give a defense for the hope that's in you, that was to a particular people who in the first century who were being marginalized, who were being exiled, who were suffering. And so that word from Peter was given directly to this local church. And so we feel that apologetics arises out of your church experience and the way you're formed, whether you're listening to the story of God in the scriptures, whether you're doing liturgies together, fellowshipping in small groups, confessing sin together, maybe confessing our faith, hearing God's word, or singing together, praying the Psalms, partaking in the sacraments. These are formative. And so the apologist is being formed in the local church, and apologetics is done for a particular people who live in that location. So it's just, I think it would have been bizarre for St. Augustine to think about apologetics that was not ecclesial, that was not connected with the local church. I don't know if Josh wants to add some. I've gone on for a little bit, but I
would just say that again, context matters, and we need to be asking questions about what's the context which our arguments are placed within. And if the context is abstracted from embodied communities of faith who are seeking the good, who are seeking to care for their communities, then how are those arguments going to be perceived in a culture that says Christianity is bad, if they're just abstracted? But if they're put in this context that's actually caring for their local communities, then arguments are perceived differently and received differently. And then the argument is that when an apologist has actually put their life, or an evangelist or somebody trying to share with their friends about the gospel has actually put their life in the local church, that context is going to shape that person in a way that, so much of what our imaginations today, when I talk to somebody about apologetics, I remember talking to a student of mine years ago, and she was, really one of the smartest students I've ever taught. And she told me that she didn't want to take my class because apologetics is what young 19-year-old boys do in the dorm room late at night when they want to argue. And I just don't have any space for that. And I'm sympathetic with that kind of, that's what apologetics is. But her imagination didn't say, this is what the pastor does to try to convince people that Christ is the good life. This is what happens in the church when somebody's full of despair and doubt, and their friend comes to them and says, look, you can have hope. Let me show you my wounds and how the gospel actually changes things, so you can have hope and joy in Christ. So her imagination was what she had seen in the dorm room or on YouTube kind of videos, where it really becomes a spectacle.
Yeah.
And I'm sympathetic to her to want to avoid the spectacle. Fortunately, after the class, she said, I'm sold now. This is something different. But I think our imaginations about what apologetics has either brought a lot of people who are into this world of apologetics that are looking to just beat people, and people who don't want to do that have run the other way.
Yeah.
And I think, again, this is why, coming back to Augustine, who is both confrontational, but ultimately sees this is the key to life. And so he ultimately is doing this as a pastor who has been called to love God and love others. And this is an expression of his love for others. And so we think the church is the way to formulate, is God's means to form these types of individuals in a way that, once you abstract that from an embodied community, you often get something that looks rather different. And I think it's maybe why we've run into some of the problems at large with apologetics.
I think this gets at, I think it was Peter Berger, sociologist, Peter Berger, who talked about plausibility structures. And so if I could, the plausibility structures, is this believable? Is there a framework that makes something believable? So let's say the idea of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we know, we could list right now, all of us probably quickly, arguments and evidence for the resurrection of Christ. We go boom, 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 boom. And those are very, very, very important. But if a local community sees a local church, the living Christ living within a community of love and care and support and help, and Christ through the Spirit of God is alive, and his resurrection life is being incarnated in that body and lived out in the community, then you combine the rational arguments and the evidential arguments with a plausibility structure of the love of that they can actually see, feel, and experience, then it makes for a much more powerful argument, and it makes it more believable. I mean, it makes the gospel and the truth of the resurrection more believable.
So, and we actually made some notes on this. We have this quote in the book from Augustine. So
this is great.
So one of the things about the methodology, which we haven't gotten into as much in this interview, but it actually preaches well. And this has been one of the critiques of apologetics. I mean, you have some traditional arguments, which again, I think can be used and picked up in various different ways. But, have you tried to incorporate like Aquinas's 5 ways into any sermons, pastors? I mean, it gets a little dicey there.
That's not,
try to do it.
or very helpful.
but Augustine was able to bring what he's doing into the pulpit. You might even say it came out of the pulpit.
Yeah.
And he's using these approaches as he preaches. And there's this one sermon where he's given basically an apologetic sermon where they've let pagans in, and then he dismisses the pagans and he addresses the congregation. And we have the record of this. This is what he says. He said, "I've already said to you yesterday, brothers and sisters, and I say it again now, and I'm always begging you to win over those who haven't yet believed by leading good lives. Otherwise, you too, I fear, will have believed to no purpose. I beseech you all, in the same way as you take pleasure in the word of God, so to express that pleasure in the lives you lead. Let God's word please you, not only in your ears, but in your hearts too. Not only in your hearts, but also in your lives, so that you may be God's household, acceptable in his eyes and fit for every good work. I haven't the slightest doubt, brothers and sisters, that if you live in a manner worthy of God, the time will very soon come when none of those who have not yet believed will remain in unbelief." A little rhetorical flourish there at the end. So Augustine sees, okay, what have I just done? I've given this apologetic argument in this sermon, and now let me make sure my congregation knows you must live lives worthy of the gospel. And that's essential to how these arguments are going to be heard.
Yeah. So this is good, and this is my last question, and kind of tying into what you guys just said, and a little bit of the methodological approach. And this is from your last chapter 5. And you profile a few modern theologians, and I won't ask about all of them. And one I'll focus on. I love that you guys talked about her early in this. Is the one that I kind of resonate with most myself. It's focused on Sarah Coakley and her interaction with Thomas Kuhn, which is where we get, you guys talk about what are you seeking? So how does she help model an Augustinian method or an approach to apologetics? And how can she, in her modeling, help us model the same thing as well?
Yeah, I think I would describe her as offering fundamentally Augustinian instincts in the way that she interacts with Kuhn in this video. And by the way, in the book, we cite where you can actually see this online, or you can just search for it. It's Sarah Coakley, and she's talking with Thomas Kuhn. I believe the YouTube video is something like "Why Should I Believe?"
Yeah, I watched it. Yep.
I'm not sure if you can get that in the show notes, but and the show actually gave us permission to use a good chunk of that in the book.
Yeah. We'll link in the show notes. For this.
Yeah. Yep. So he starts off asking, "Why should I believe in Christianity?" And she wants to make clear, as we are, and I hope the listeners have heard this, we're open to a whole range of arguments for God's existence, for Christianity being true. And she wants to make that clear to Kuhn in this interaction. But before she rushes into giving the cosmological argument or the teleological argument or other arguments, she wants to know why he asked the question to begin with. And see what Coakley has seen, and she says she's picking up on certain priestly intuitions. She has, and I think that's actually really important. Here's someone who sees himself as somebody who's in the church, who has to actually have certain intuitions, pastoral intuitions, and she refers to that, I think, a couple times in the video. But she intuits that if she kind of starts off with just giving these arguments, he's going to quickly, as a kind of rationalist, say, well, it doesn't, I can find a way out of that. I can find a way out of that. And it's never going to be high enough.
It opens a door for objections on the front end versus getting to know him on the front end.
Yes. And so she's wanting to ask the question, why are you asking this? And particularly, what are you seeking? Again, coming back to what we've said before. But his response is that if he were to come to faith because of any existential reasons that he even in the interview admits to, meaning and value, I think something along those lines, different things, he fears that he's going to be duping himself. That's his language. But she points out basically that this would mean if he takes that route and says, okay, I've got to try to block off all these kind of, whether it's emotional or desires or existential kind of things going on, I've got to block those off. She's basically saying you might just be closing off the very way that God is seeking to break in. And he is saying, essentially, no, I'll only believe if I stay in control. And this is what Coakley's pointing out. In other words, I'll only believe on my way, in my way. And it needs to be this kind of rationalistic approach. And I'm not going to do it in this other way. In other words, God's got to come on my terms. And Coakley, in a very, again, pastoral way, but blunt way, if you listen to this, is challenging those, challenging his basic assumptions, and says, no, actually, what if God, and she used this kind of subjunctive mood, what if God is actually seeking to break through the heart, through these desires? And if you open yourself up to that, what you're actually opening yourself up to is a kind of humility and a different posture. And she's saying that these arguments, these traditional arguments, will actually hit you a different way if you have a kind of humility. And I think, again, if you read Augustine, his big thing throughout is humility. His fundamental sin is pride. And so much of what he's trying to do with the philosophers, especially the Platonists, who he has some overlaps with and thinks they're the best game in town other than Christianity. But he says their issue is their pride. And so he's constantly trying to humble other people. And it's clear that Coakley's trying to humble Kuhn in this exchange, so he might be more open to receive the arguments and even some of these profoundly existential arguments. And so then I think all of a sudden you approach, once you kind of humble the person, help them, and she ultimately does it through death, and the reality that as much as he fears losing control, he doesn't really have control, and he's not actually in control of everything he believes, in a way to humble him. And then and these are my words, not hers, but I think the proofs become something like testimonies. The proofs become, or as N.T. Wright would say, broken signposts, and can be reimagined as kind of a signpost in the world, in our nature, in our inner lives, in nature around us, in creation, and most supremely signposts that the most supreme signpost of all would be Jesus Christ. and he's saying all of these are signposts to the reality of God. And but you're not just going to perceive them if you take this kind of hard, rationalistic, and even prideful approach to those arguments. Mark, by the way, what we could have just said is go watch the video, because I'm trying to describe what Coakley did.
We can still say, go watch the video.
Good primer.
Yeah, totally.
I think you're right on target. I like she uses the phrase Kantian heteronomy, where he's afraid for something outside of him to in some way influence him. So what he does is he buffers himself through this rationalistic approach to a true encounter with the grace of God, and the way that God would want to get in, and the way that God does get in and work in our lives. He was cordoning himself off and separating himself from that God working in that way.
Mm.
And actually, this, just real quick, I won't be long on this, but I just want to bring up a point and theological point, which is we would just say that the Spirit must work and the Spirit uses means, right? So we're not all of this, and this is our emphasis is on keeping in step with the Spirit, that we would be apologists who are tuned to the Spirit and displaying the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, but also recognizing that God must do a work. So we don't see as arguments over here and then the work of the Spirit over here.
Yeah,
we see a God who's big enough to work through all of this and uses means and uses people. So that's an assumption that we haven't mentioned, but it's an assumption throughout our project.
Yeah, ultimately the Holy Spirit's in control of convicting and knowing that pride creates walls that it goes back to the fall,
Yeah.
the first lie in the
The
garden.
rationalistic
really.
arguments sometimes don't penetrate those prideful walls. They kind of allow you to keep those up and say, let's just talk on the intellectual level, not on the personal level.
Yeah, going back to the fall, that's what started this all, with the pride underlining it, creating, no, we want to do things on our terms. We want to worship our own God and ourselves. And if we come to Jesus, we want to say, okay, now we're ready, but that's just not how it works. So, going into my last question, you state in the conclusion of your book that you're not trying to provide a new apologetic model in the stream of Augustinian thought, but allowing Augustine's life, work, and preaching to help us approach our culture as he approached his. How might churches and individuals, whether they be pastors, teachers, lay people, engage in the Augustinian way after reading this book? Just kind of wrapping this all up.
Yeah. How do we make this practical? Which
Yeah.
is a super fair question. Let's think of let's change and begin to see apologetics and spiritual formation as two sides of the same coin, right? Because there's an Augustinian realism we need to have here. There's even in the life of the church, even for those who are part of the city of God, we are still dealing with our own doubts. We're still we haven't reached perfection. And so we have actually allowed in our lives the false idols to come in too. We actually buy into false narratives too, and so it's not as if, okay, Augustine confessions, he's dealing with this vainglory and ambition, and then by the time he gets to book 10 and he's converted, that's no longer an issue for him. Actually, Augustine says it's still an issue in book 10. And so he recognizes that actually spiritual formation and dealing with idols, not just behavior modification in the church, is the ongoing work of a local community. But as we get better in community of actually diagnosing what's going on in our own souls and in each other's souls and in our disordered loves, and the false narratives we're embracing and the damage that they do to our relationships and our communities and within the church, we're able then to say to our non-believing friends, yes, I know all about that narrative because I live it, and it still seeps in. This is where I have seen the pitfalls. This is where I see it doesn't work. Here are the wounds, and here how Jesus makes a difference. And so spiritual formation actually, our apologetic actually hangs on our spiritual formation. And then all of a sudden in our dialogue, it's not a triumphalistic, we've got it all figured out. And by the way, Augustine regularly says he doesn't have it all figured out throughout Confessions in the City of God. He's asking a lot more questions than he answers, by the way. That's by design in the books, okay? So he doesn't answer everything. So this actually gives us a certain kind of changes our posture, because we're broken people still that God is healing, but we haven't been fully healed. And it makes us better at diagnosing what's going on in our culture and in the lives of the people we're trying to win over for the gospel. So I actually think that seeing this together really helps, because if you say, hey, let's just do apologetics over here, well, that's very abstract from our life together here. And if you just say, hey, let's do spiritual formation, and that's what the church is about, let's not worry about witness. Again, I actually think these can be taught in the same kind of course. It should be modeled in our preaching and all that we do. So that's where we're trying to go in the book, to try to help people see those connections. Just a practical way, as I would say, one way to start something is, and I want to just kind of say, my friend at Redeemer Press, Craig Ellis, I just talked to him about this a few weeks ago, but what they're doing now is they go find the 10% in their church who are very concerned about non-believers. And he says to come up, and what they've done is said, hey, who wants to start praying for non-believers? we're going to start a group. And who, not necessarily who wants to argue, who wants to pray for non-believers. And then as they do that, begin to have conversations about, okay, how can we do some training so that we can better engage them and go from there. And so you're probably not going to get 100% of the church who are up for a training, but if you can say who are the people who are burdened for their friends and coworkers, who are wanting to see them come to Christ, and begin with that group, and then what can happen is that can have a ripple effect. It also means that when they come to church, if they can have those conversations and then invite people to church, if the preacher can be prepared to kind of interweave in apologetics in different ways through the sermon and speak to them as if they are there, and be very aware of that, that's going to make people more likely to bring their friends and feel supported in what they're doing. So those are just some different ways. One more thing here. Sorry, Mark. I've got so much to say because I've been the last 5 years we've been on the ground here trying to do some of this. Is Chris, and then you guys have already had him. Chris Watkin is Biblical Critical Theory is a great book that's really modeling some of the approach. We didn't know about his book till the very end. We have a footnote, but his book actually wasn't even released when we turned ours in. And since then, I've met Chris, and there's just a ton of overlap between the vision and then what he's actually doing in his book. The other book that's smaller, that could be something that could be helpful, is one I've written telling about our story, which is really more popular and for the church, something that you could actually use for training within the church.
Yeah.
Mine is very, very basic. I think get a copy of Confessions and read it, and maybe from the point of view that you've heard today. But I think if Augustine was here, he would say the thing that has changed him is reading the scriptures and worshiping and praying the Psalms until it's scripting your life, especially doing that in the church community with other people, and making that actually the narrative that you're living in. The scripture, in Confessions, look, if you got a version that has like the footnotes, look at how many times he alludes to the Psalms and how many times he's alluding to scripture. And so know your culture very, very well, be aware of it, and immerse yourself in the biblical narrative, in the biblical story, and especially pray the Psalms. And that transforming effect and that integration in your own life will help you connect with others and help them see how the story connects with their life.
And his mother was praying for him daily before his conversion. So that was powerful, that he can look back on and be so thankful to God and his mother. And so when we're praying for unbelievers, who knows, you might be praying for a future person like Augustine.
Yes, absolutely.
I just want to point out that this is reflective of our friendship. You guys asked that question, and I gave the books you need to read, and very kind of rationalistic. This is what you need to do on the ground. This is your plan. And Mark says you need to pray and read the Bible. And I just want to say his was a better answer, but they both can go together.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we'll just say Mark is a little holier than Josh right now.
Yeah, we can end there.
I'm older. Okay.
Yeah, just more pastoral. This is all great, and this is really helpful. And thank you guys so much, for writing this book, wrestling with these texts, wrestling with Augustine and how he speaks today. But it's been a pleasure having both of you guys on our show and to talk about this, to talk to our current day and age, not just condemnatory against our age, but to talk to them, to ask them questions, and not just a holier than thou, but let's walk together in this life that we both live. And
Yeah.
we're beggars looking to the person who gave us bread. But thank you guys so much for wisdom, for pastoral insight, for not just my way or the highway, but let's talk things through better together. Thank you guys so much.
Appreciate it. Peter and Nick, thanks so much for having us.
Thank
Of
you.
course.
God bless.